and welcome to a new episode of the AST podcast. This is a Valentine's Day special podcast, and it follows on from a fascinating conversation we had some weeks back. We were looking at immigration to Nova Scotia. We were looking at Nova Scotia's reputation as a very, very welcoming place. And in the conversation, we heard very, very clearly from people from diverse backgrounds that Nova Scotia's welcome is in many ways predicated upon sameness. That people who don't fit the template, the idealized template of a white, Eurocentric immigrant were met with far less welcome than those from more diverse backgrounds. Another institution which sees itself as extremely welcoming is the church. The church prides itself on being welcoming. Pretty much every website for every church in Nova Scotia will say, we are a welcoming community. Today we're going to interrogate that. Is the church a welcoming place? Is it an inclusive place? And to discuss that, we have three wonderful guests. We have McLean, who is a Sunday school teacher at Woodlawn United Church. Julia is the daughter of the very Reverend Shanon McLean.
Not quite reverend.
When are you, well, soon to be.
May 24th.
May 24th.
You can call me reverend.
Shannon has ministered at Woodlawn United for how long?
10 and a half years.
10 and a half years. Oh my goodness. And on what's your date for St. Andrew's, Truro?
July 1st.
On July 1st, Shannon moves to take up a role as the head minister at St. Andrew's in Truro. We also have Tamsin Robson, who is a first-year M.Div student here at Atlantic School of Theology, and is the student minister at Port Wallis United. And so we're all very, very excited to have you with us to speak about this fascinating topic. It's a topic which was planted front and center of my consciousness about a year ago with your grad project, Shannon. Could you start us off by telling us a wee bit about your grad project and the ground that tilled?
Sure. So, as most people probably know, here at AST, we pick a topic that we're passionate about to explore deeply in our grad project. And so I chose the topic of looking at the ministry of people with intellectual disabilities and how that has been accepted or not accepted or nurtured or not nurtured within the church. And so it involved interviewing people from different L'Arche communities in Canada and looking at the spirituality and how that is really helped along or hindered in congregations in Canada. Protestant congregations is what I looked at.
And what did you find?
I found that while it is very common, I guess what I found is that the welcome is increasing all the time. Right. That inclusion of opening your doors and being accepting to people with disabilities is becoming more and more common. However, taking it to that next step is where we need to go next. And so that people with intellectual disabilities actually have something to teach us. And it's not just that we need to be welcoming to this traditionally marginalized group, but that we actually need to learn from them and allow them to be in positions that change the congregation and ways that the church needs to change so that worship itself can be accessible by people with intellectual disabilities. And in doing so, it actually means that church is more accessible to most people. One of the things that came out of my grad project that I really liked was one of the participants, one of my co-researchers, they said, it's kind of like curb cuts in a sidewalk. They're meant for people in wheelchairs, but they're also really good for people with strollers or people who use a walker or people who are carrying a bunch of stuff in their hands, right? And so by making it more accessible to one group, you often do actually open it up for a lot of different people.
One of the fascinating things that I heard in your grad project, and it was something that given the space allotted in your grad project couldn't be really explored because it would take just 2 or 3 books to explore properly. But there's a sense in which, within a more colonial context, exclusion served the purpose of aggrandizing the dominant or the hegemonic group, you know, and so people excluded in order to elevate themselves.
Right.
The context has changed significantly, and there's a sense in which people now are benevolently welcoming in order to aggrandize themselves again.
Right.
But what you were looking at was that this logic of inclusion and welcome still prioritized this is what normal people ought to look like, and because we're so fabulous, we're going to welcome you and accept and tolerate you.
Right.
And that is, again, just another ruse of colonial power.
So one of the things that I found is people with the people who I interviewed and talked about were people with intellectual disabilities.
Yeah.
I think in the church there's actually been a fair bit done on different types of physical disabilities and being deaf and not being able to see, those types of things. And so this was this particular subgroup that seems to be still very much on the margins and often not included, because a lot of people with intellectual disabilities don't behave the way you should in church. And so then you have these competing kinds of concerns. So for example, if somebody with an intellectual disability has vocal outbursts throughout the service, that may or may not disturb other people around them from what they perceive worship should be like. How do you find the balance between those things? And still, in our society, what rules is the status quo of the way it has always been. Mm-hmm. And so, we welcome people with intellectual disabilities as long as they can behave the way you're supposed to behave in church. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And so that's where we're at, I think. I think we're at this point where you're right, like the powerful who've always made the decisions and who have always decided what normal is, still are doing that. Right. And part of the reason we're welcoming people is, I shouldn't say that, but I think one of the reasons that we're being more opening is because it's not cool to not be opening. Of course. Right? Yeah. And so we are, but I think the real litmus test of this kind of inclusion is when people feel that they belong, as opposed to just are included in the congregation.
I very much want to touch on your experience, Tamsin, but before then, there's a point that I want you to help us understand. To be a Christian and to have Christian worship, to be a Christian leader, a Christian minister, is to be, in a sense, Christ-like, or to seek to be Christ-like. Christ is the norm, and Christ's body is a broken body. Christ's abilities vis-a-vis what is considered normative at the time is deficient, and there are ways of inhabiting and representing Christ that, I think, as you were saying, people with different abilities can bring that we're deaf to. There's also a sense, and this was very, very powerful to me, and I want you to speak a bit about this if you can, Tamsin. The service you led for the Day of Remembrance because one of the things which was really important there was the pollination of our models of God and the pollination of our understanding of Christ, which you were able to bring by voicing the experience of the victims of violence against transgender people.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that a little bit. So I led a Transgender Day of Remembrance service in late November here at AST. And my motives for it were twofold. And one of them was definitely education. Because I feel like as much as the church is trying to be inclusive, gender education specifically, or education around trans issues, is still pretty lacking. And yeah, again, even at the church where I'm doing student ministry right now, I hear a lot of, it's okay, we don't discriminate. And I'm like, okay, well, you've mastered step one. This sounds good. Now we'll teach you about pronouns. But sort of the thing that I based the entire service around was the idea that trans people's gender expression, or the idea of a multitude of gender expressions, is sort of an inherently divine thing. That, of course, God is beyond gender. And I have this kind of liberation theology credo, which is that we are supposed to see Christ in marginalized people, like Christ is to us a racialized body, Christ is a broken body. Christ is a genderqueer body in a way. I might get into that later. But I found this incredibly, incredibly arresting image of a trans woman artist from Sao Paulo, Brazil, who marched in a pride parade several years ago, basically as the crucified Christ, except the crucified Christ is a trans woman of color. And by the way, Brazil is the most dangerous place to be a trans woman. And I ended the sermon with this. It's like, in the United Church, we don't like to dwell on the guilt-inducing crucified Christ, but I want you to take a look at this, because maybe this is also Christ. Christ is crucified every time a trans person is killed or rejected or turned away, and is resurrected every time we are affirmed.
Right. And that's, I think, something which is common between that overwhelmingly moving service and your grad project, that the perspective was that Christ is someone who challenges us, is someone who we seek to hopefully be transformed into, and the capacity to do so requires that those who can more innately represent Christ, who is neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, that these people are not people who need to be included, but they're people who ought be leaders, who are absolutely necessary if we're to move beyond the brutal conflation of Christianity with the hegemonic power structure in the Western world. And so it's not that it was sort of that the churches need to include, but that the churches need to sort of be hopefully saved, by people with these different perspectives. And I think that's very different from inclusion, right? Because I think we're not speaking about everybody needs to be included, hey, Nazi, come on, we're going to include you. That the kind of perspectives you were speaking about, Tamsin, at that service, and the kind of perspectives that you were speaking about at your grad project, these are Christological perspectives, and therefore leadership needs to come in these ways. And again, we need to get to the experience part, and this is entirely on me getting excited by the ideas you're offering and sort of getting sidetracked. But how, and this is an impossible question, so apologies, how can the church accept this bomb which needs to blow up its complacent identification with bourgeois culture in the modern West? And what is the role that people of difference can play in that? Again, apologies for the question, but would you please speak to that?
I think that we say that the church needs to change. We say that the church needs to be open, but it actually needs to be open to looking at things in a different way. And so a lot of the stories that I heard in my grad project from the people who were interviewed were stories where the people were able to share their gifts in a way that was very authentic to what they had to share, as opposed to trying to fill them into these pre-cut holes that were meant to already be there. So, for example, one story I love is about so at large there are assistants, the people who live and work in the community and assist people who are called core members who have intellectual disabilities. And so often people will also go to church in the community, in addition to having a spiritual kind of life within the community. And so this one time there was an assistant and a core member. This core member spoke in a language that was only his own. And so the assistant, of course, was asked at church, will you read today the scripture? And so he said, sure, we'll read. And he didn't even think of it, but they probably weren't asking them to read. And so they went up together and the assistant read the passage from the Bible, and then he opened the book, and the man who was with him with the disability, he read in his own language, his own understanding of what it said, in a way that probably most people would not be able to understand the words. Yet I would be willing to bet that most people in that church heard God a lot more in that second interpretation of the reading than they did in the first interpretation. In the same way that I attend worship, we sometimes go with our friend Anne, and Anne likes to get the congregation to stand at the appropriate times for hymns. And that's not a role in the church, yet she has wholeheartedly taken on this role of turning around and getting everybody to stand up. And like having that kind of joy and that kind of understanding of the liturgy, like it really does, I think, open up the worship to the Spirit in a new way. And that's it. We need to be open to the fact that just reading, just praying in words that we all understand, just singing hymns that we've sang forever. Like these things are some of the ways that we can experience God, build our relationship with God, experience the Holy Spirit. But there are also lots of other ways that we haven't even begun to understand. So just one other quick story. When I was leading confirmation classes at one point, there was a time when if your intellect was not considered normal, you probably couldn't be confirmed, because how could you possibly go to confirmation classes and understand, and recite and do these things which are important, apparently, to become a member of the church. And instead of trying to fit these folks who don't fit into that, right, it's changing the program so that it's more accessible for all people, or even learning from some of these people who already have such an amazing spirituality that they can teach us, as opposed to us needing to teach them.
Yeah, absolutely. The point is not necessarily about inclusion per se.
No.
It's simply about that these are gifts which enable someone to be in persona Christi. If we are serious about being transformed by the presence of Christ, then we need to be led in different ways. And it's something that I see all the time when the realpolitik, the pragmatism of ordination and analysis of students who are moving towards ministry, that quote unquote pragmatism, that realpolitik, that yes, but how would they cope here and how would they cope there? Again, it involves a cookie cutter model from a church which has failed and a church which is dying rapidly, and is dying rapidly because it bound itself so tightly to a particular model of what society ought to look like. And these are the voices which can pollinate this perspective, and they're being either conform or we will weed you out, which is very, very painful. Tamsin, can you speak a little bit about your experience of church as a trans person? Let's take it back to that very, very, very basic question about the gulf between people's self-understanding as as open and inclusive and welcoming, and the reality on the ground. Is that the reality on the ground?
That's so complicated. Yeah, so complicated. Yeah. I do want to say, with regard to like the analysis of preparing people for ordination and the cookie cutter model, as a person with mental illness, I'm super terrified of that. Like, I'm having a terrible time this semester, and I feel like, you know, I haven't even filed my suitability paperwork. Which is a step for ordination in the United Church. I find, like I said, the idea that, you know, we don't discriminate is the first step of a very, very long path. And so I think for me, as a non-binary person in particular, coming out as genderqueer, as non-binary within a church community was really, really interesting, because to this day I still get heed in my home church. And thankfully there are a critical mass of people who are around to just like gently correct folks who slip back into the old pronoun. But I think a lot of people frame that as an issue of grammar, especially as somebody who usually uses the pronoun singular they. So, you know, Tamsin preached their sermon on such a date. I'm a little unfocused today. My apologies. Yeah, as somebody who uses singular they pronouns, often people's discomfort with that is chalked up to a particular view of grammar, that they've learned grammar prescriptively and that they've been taught that they is exclusively plural. It neglects a wider issue of needing to change the way you think about people, because as many conflicting gender signifiers as I might put on myself in the run of a day, people are still going to hear my voice or look at the way I carry myself or my height. And just like the box male gets ticked, when my self-understanding is much, much more expensive than that. I'm also incoherent in a lot of ways to the straight cisgender imagination, which I can.
And that, I think, is one of the really exciting things about that. And I know it's painful for you.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
but that's visible, real-time transformation and salvation. For me, like what I mean by that is that discomfort. So again, my brain is a binary brain, day, night, black, white, male, female, right? And so I automatically categorize things in binary ways, and so I experience you in a binary as she, and so therefore my reflex is Tamsin, she. Like, they.
Possibly because you're from a place where that name is more common.
Right.
Like in
Gotcha.
the UK and Ireland, it's a very popular girl's name.
Gotcha. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And but how rare is it that we get to actually see transformation and salvation, such that anguish, that discomfort in saying not she, they, not she, they, not she, they, is literally broadening my categories. It's overcoming those binaries that are there, and I get to actually experience that, which is just an overwhelming gift.
And there was one class, I think, where you pointed to me in an extended analogy, started using she pronouns, and then gradually transitioned to they pronouns. And it was just like, it was the most affirmed I've felt at AST so far. And yeah, just to have that feedback, it's like, wow, I can finally be at home. Even though, like, I've started using she pronouns at Port Wallis because sort of as an auxiliary form of address, because at least it's not he.
Right.
And if people can think of me as a non-man first, that is the first step.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, that's an example of this overwhelming giftedness that people who, you know, for example, yes, we want to have people with differences, and then you have, I feel like, a nonverbal person on the autism spectrum shouting and screaming. I can't hear that. I can't hear the sermon. You know, but to realize that that's the real time beginning to crumble of the categories of sin which have held us down, you know.
One of the things that I want to say that I think you said that was so important is that people really do believe that the problem with they is grammar.
Yeah.
And it actually has nothing to do with grammar. I mean, it has to do with grammar a little bit, I should say, because I still have to try to get my brain to say it. The way I learned how to read was not phonetically even, it was by sight.
Oh, same.
And so for me, that's how I learn. If I speak another language extremely poorly as I do, that's how I learn is that there's one kind of word that you use for things. And so that's true. But it is when you open up something that you were sure of, that there are men and women and that there are two options and that's it. And now that's not true.
What a boring world that would be.
Well, exactly. But when you open up that one, you're actually opening up all those other ones. What do you mean it's not just black and white?
Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean it's not just day
Great
and
point.
night? What do you mean it's not? And so the fact that it's grammar, it's the same thing, I think, with people with intellectual disabilities, or even children in worship. We recently had a situation. I mean, what church doesn't say we want children?
Yeah.
Right? But bring 1-year-old twins into your church, into your worship, who are becoming more vocal and also, hitting things every once in a while, right? And all of a sudden people are like, well, we want children, but... Or we actually had someone in the congregation go up and take a toy from a child because they deemed that they were being too loud. And so this is it. Like, it's not about the noise. It's about the fact that what does it mean to accept children who were never welcomed in church previously, unless they could, toe the line, to welcome people with disabilities, to welcome people who are queer, what does it mean? And how does it make you crumble? Yeah.
Yeah. I have a weird story about this, which is kind of twofold. Number one, so I went to a church as a child, which had a bit of what is now considered a bit of an unusual Sunday school setup. And they would have Sunday school for about half an hour before the service. Mm-hmm. But it was before the service, so I could sit in on the worship service if I wanted to. Because I was going with my parents, usually that was the easiest thing to do. I couldn't walk home. Mm-hmm. And if I was bored, they would give me a book to read, and we kind of made a covenant that Bible-related books are to be read in church. Just so we stay on topic at least. But I think...
no Peppa Pig for you.
That normalized putting me on the trajectory where I am now, because I'm steeped in that kind of liturgy.
Yeah.
And that particular pastor's style of preaching entered my DNA. So whenever I step up to the pulpit, I think of him and just how incredibly passionate and practical he was. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, last week at Port Wallis, and there's some tension between the parents apparently as to how to handle this. One parent is a bit more permissive, the other is a bit more, oh no, they might break something, keep them in the pews. But yeah, I was just sitting in the choir, and there was this young child just kind of running around, checking out the back of the pulpit, disappearing into the choir room, reappearing out of the choir room. There was nothing that they could knock over, so I feel it was relatively safe. Mm-hmm. I talked to Ivan about it, and he did say, sometimes it does distract the congregation, especially if there's danger of knocking something over, etc., etc. But my immediate instinct, because I want to normalize children in church, because if we don't normalize children in church, we just breed a generation, or bring forth a generation that, grows up and is not used to church, sees it as irrelevant. Whereas, and so my conclusion is to say, no, don't worry, folks, that's just the Holy Spirit.
Mm. Yeah. So I really understand the story you talk about with the child who's running around. And I think that one of the most important things is that from the pulpit, it is stated that I am fine with this, because I think a lot of people's discomfort in situations like that is their interpretation that the person who is preaching is distracted by this and we have to stop it. Not that they are necessarily distracted. So that's something that we're going to try to move towards a little bit at Woodlawn. I recently had a funeral for a woman who comes, Irene, who's been coming to Woodlawn for 5 years or maybe a bit more. She was nonverbal and had a disability and was in a wheelchair near the end of her life. And so she died. And I presided over the funeral, which was such a gift for me to be able to do that, really. And so a lot of people in the congregation came from the group home that she was affiliated with. So there's her home and then all the other ones that kind of fall under that umbrella. And so for 20 minutes of the funeral, there was one man in the congregation who yelled, "Ah! Ah! Ah!" the whole time. And then eventually somebody else thought, oh, that's kind of fun. And so there was this echo. Ah, 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 that went on. And so from the front, I said, I am so happy that everybody who wants to be here is here. And even though there is some noise going on, I am okay with that. Like, people need to be able to make this possible. At another funeral I did, and I've only done like about 8 or 10 funerals. At another funeral, the daughter, so the grandmother died, and in her home lived a daughter and a granddaughter. And the granddaughter has autism and does have some verbal kinds of verbalizations that are quite loud at times, and there was absolutely no consideration for her coming to the funeral. And then I said, well, why? And it just never crossed their minds that she would be welcome. And so we talked about, like, this is a space she can walk around. We had the school come in so that she had a pre-visit so that she could kind of know the space and you know what was going to happen and everything. And I think that it was very meaningful for everybody who was there to make sure that she was welcome. Mm-hmm. And so, Julia, you've been going to Woodlawn for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about what you do at Woodlawn. No, just leave it. It's good.
I've been helping out with Sunday schools and stuff, and I help out with the homeless shelter. I've been singing in choir at the Christmas Eve thing, and I've been reading, like, we done plays. Feel like welcome, like, I feel like when my friends, like, talking around, I don't, like, feel included.
You don't feel included?
Like, when everybody was talking, like, around, like, everybody's, like, being in, like, a group, and I...
So there's been times when you felt...
I've been, like, left out.
So here's the group
and
here's you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what makes you feel more like you're part of that group? What can people do to help you feel like you're part of the group?
Like, if I could ask if I can be, like,
welcomed in.
Welcome in and not, like, feeling left out. And it's kind of really hard for me being in a group, but not.
Right. And sometimes it depends on what the group does, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, what are some things you're really good at?
I'm really good at singing, because on Mondays, we have intellectual disability, like, for choirs on Mondays. Mm-hmm. And I'm really good at...
With Adam, who's from Tamsin's church.
Oh, Adam. Yeah, he's really good.
And what else are you really good at?
Swimming.
Yes, that's true.
Nice.
You have a whole box of medals.
Oh, well done.
From Special Olympics, right?
Yeah.
And what else are you really good at?
Track. Sometimes track, but I don't do...
And what are you good at in church? What are you good at that you can share with other people at church?
Story.
Telling stories. Yeah. And also you have this amazing ability to be able to know how people are feeling. So you are the teacher of what class? The big kids or the little tiny kids?
The tiny kids.
The tiny kids. And sometimes they don't even talk yet. But you can tell when one of them is feeling upset.
And I go over and I ask them what's wrong with them, and I cheer them up and make them feel happy.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
I often I find it very difficult to relate to really young children. So, yeah, I'm always amazed when someone can do that.
She has this ability to be able to read emotions, unlike anybody else I know, really, right?
Yeah.
And so in church, what are some of the things that are hard?
Money.
Money is hard for you,
really
being
hard.
able to count money, right? Yeah. And what else?
Streets, like different kind of
Reading the words,
like,
right? Yeah. And so we've had to kind of work to find ways that you can share those gifts you have with using the strong parts of you, but not having to rely on the other parts that you're kind of weaker in, right?
A different kind of, wherever my access was going, like different, dropping people off, like, I don't know where I, like.
You can get confused to where you are.
Oh.
Although your sense of direction is quite a bit better than mine.
Yeah. Dartmouth is difficult to navigate, just saying.
Oh, plus she works in Halifax.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah, sometimes they go all over the place. And then can you think of anybody else in the church who has a disability who comes every week maybe, and what it's been like for them in the church, do you think? Jim, yeah. So Jim comes. He's only been coming for a couple of years probably. And at the beginning, what do you think it was like?
Kind of is confused.
Kind of confusing. Yeah. Did a lot of people talk to him at the beginning?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably people welcomed him. But Jim's a bit hard to understand sometimes. And I think that people weren't really taking the time to really get to know him, right? And so sometimes he'd come on the Excessive Bus early and you'd sit and talk to him, right?
Yeah.
I think welcoming people is one of your gifts as well. But now what has Jim done in the church? How has he been the leader?
Like I bring him I ask him some tea.
No, how has he been leader? What has he done in the church?
He's been doing like plays and stuff.
Yeah, he was an actor at a play. You guys both were, weren't you? When we were talking about the banquet, and Jesus said, don't invite all the people who can invite you back, but invite the people who can't, right?
Yeah.
And who else? And what else does he I mean? He's also kind of given bulletins probably out and greets people at the door.
Yeah.
And do you think he feels more like he's kind of part of Woodlawn now than he used to?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's so good. I'm glad.
And what's happening at Woodlawn in terms of Julia's involvement is something you'll replicate at St. Andrews in Truro?
I actually think that St. Andrews has done a fair bit of work already on being inclusive and what that looks like and being open to that type of thing. It's always different with a different group of people, right? And so and I think going beyond that part where it's just tokenism and becoming a part where we can actually see Christ in the people and that's all people, right? But when you exclude the people who have been traditionally on the margins from being able to show us something that we couldn't see otherwise, I think that we lose a lot. And so it's moving to that level.
Right. So it seems that there are two related but distinct elements here. On the one hand, there is the leaders and the saints and the martyrs who can lead the church in the 21st century, people who have non-traditional identities, non-traditional skill sets, who can help broaden how we think about God, how we think about the world, and how we are in the world. But not everybody in the church is called to be a prophet or a saint or a martyr. And there are lots of people who have no interest in that, no call to that. But that is where the question of inclusion is a factor. And so we've spoken a little bit, and we will speak again about the leadership roles. But is there anything you can tell me and maybe some of our listeners and hearers about how to do that inclusion piece better? Tamsin, do you have any hints and tips for people, because there's a whole host of... So let me give you an example. I was at a convocation. Was it a convocation? It was some kind of event. And there was a trans person in the choir, and I was kind of sitting across from them. And after about 5 minutes, I realized I've been looking at that person, you know.
Okay.
I've been going, trans person, you know. So like, you know, help us do this better. What's the, you know, how we want to create, you know, like a sort of, the church needs to be able to create a space where people don't feel, what the hell is wrong with this guy, you know? Is it just, David, you're screwed, just, you know, the best thing you can do is stay home, close the door, and don't come out? Or what in general? How can people like me, who are not very good at a lot of stuff, do inclusion better?
Oh my goodness. That story is so amusing for me because I have definitely been at an AST convocation where the faculty faced the choir, and I don't remember anybody's specific face, but I was flirting with vocation at the time, and I remember distinctly receiving these, we knew we would have to fit you into our theology sooner or later. So I feel like that was me. So good. But yeah, oh goodness, I am atypical among trans people, I think. Unlike a lot of trans people, I'm okay with my given name, which is not Tamsin, but it is, like Tamsin is apostolic. My given name is kind of more angelic, and that's all I'll say about that for the moment. Just like thinking beyond the binary. Mm-hmm. Learning to be comfortable with asking questions like, what are your pronouns? And like, there are some trans people that are going to find that very difficult because it's a signal that, I'm not getting read as my lived gender. Right. But I think for me, it's always better to err on the side of caution. Using language, knowing how to use language. Like there are more genders, but there are more types of people in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in most of our philosophies, even mine. So just, taking some extra time to like watch how the other person uses language, watch how the other person self-refers, and just being tuned into that, I think, can go an incredibly long way. Other than that, acting natural is just... and that's not a slight on you.
Unless natural is staring the person down.
I've got binaries here, and I'm not sure this is...
I don't know. I consider a god of binaries that creates binaries kind of shortchanging God.
That's exactly it.
On that note.
That's exactly it, yeah.
Like, God is too big for binaries. Yeah. God is even too big for spectrums. God, like, my concept of God is a god of galaxies.
Right. Yeah, and that's again, and I think that sort of brings us back into to the leadership role, that the challenge that. So I'm thinking here about Basil of Caesarea. In the basic understanding of the world, wealth and success and power is good, and poverty and hunger is bad, and so these are good people and these are less good people. And one of the challenges in the early church, and even as late as the 4th century, is reversing that and saying that God has bound God's self from all eternity to the people on the margins. And so Basil and many others have the task of helping people see that. And the way, and this is going to sound terrible, but the way that Basil does it is, yes, with Basil's writing, but it's also with Basil's action in moving back to his diocese to starve to death alongside people who are starving to death, and that this text of his body, this corpus that he makes of himself, helps us in the church, or helped us in the church, think differently about up and down, in and out, who God is, for a millennium. And there's a sense in which the binaries of modernity has sort of dragged us right back down, and the time is coming where it's almost killed the church, it's almost killed our understanding of God. And it's not everyone who's different, but there are certain people who can incarnate Christ and indeed God in their bodies by refusing binaries or by refusing normativity. And so that's an enormous responsibility, an enormous call, which I think, which is tremendously exciting. Yeah, but if it doesn't put too much pressure.
So I think that so many binaries are made up. So, for example, able and disable is a completely and totally made up binary. It doesn't, there's no, the only thing that makes you is what we decide is disability and what we decide is not. Yeah. So, for example, one of the things I am really, really bad at is directions, is getting lost. I get lost everywhere I go. But because I now have a phone that can tell me where to go anywhere, it is no longer a disability, right? Because I have this equipment which makes that problem that I really do have disappear. If there were no stairs in this world, being in a wheelchair would not be a disability, right? Like, so I think that we make up so many of these binaries. And so success is one of these things. So this, if you're rich, if you're powerful, you're successful. If you're poor, you're not. So, Julia, I talk about you a lot in youth group when I talk about success, right? So, in a regular day, how happy are you?
Really happy.
Really happy. How much of the day do you smile? A lot. If people think of you, what do they say? Julia has such a beautiful smile. And Julia is always great and happy, right? So you come into a room and people feel better. That's what they do. You're happy. When you wake up in the morning, are you cranky in the morning? Not usually, right? Am I? Yes.
I am very often cranky. Very cranky.
I know. You don't even like to talk bad about people when it's blatantly true, right? And so to me, you are so successful. You have the life that people dream of, so that when we say all we want for our children is for them to be happy. How much money do you make in a year? Do you make money in your job?
Yeah, volunteer.
How much do you get every month in a check from the government? $50. $50. She works 30 hours a week and she makes $50. And so, is that success? No. Is it just? That's a whole other issue for a different podcast. But success, the happiest person I know is sitting right here next to me. Right? Yet on anybody else's binary scale of what success is, Julia is clearly on the other end, which is crazy because we have messed up our definition of success. And when we look at Jesus, I think the way that Jesus clearly talked about success and talked about what was important and what should we be striving for is something that Julia can teach me more about than lots of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we went to...
I didn't mean to look at you, David, because you did teach me a lot.
Sorry, Julia, go ahead.
I said when we went to Truro on, I can't remember which day, but when we did her gown thing, and I told her which way to go, because there's two, like,
Yeah, you have to always tell me, don't you?
There's like a loop around, but there's...
And I get lost immediately. Yeah. But you look at what the Pope just did, and the Pope, took this beautiful, most awesome building with this amazing view of the Vatican City and made it into housing for people who are poor. Do you know the money he lost in doing that? How is that a logical decision, right? Like, how come those poor people deserve that? Rich people who have the money to pay for it should get. It's when you decide to be a Christian, you really are committing to looking at the world upside down. And some of us do that and some of us don't. And I practice it as much as I can. I'm not always successful.
Yeah, my preaching sometimes wanders into, why don't we sell all our stuff and give it away? Yeah, and I don't know. I'm supposed to not get partisan, but I firmly believe like a truly Christian society would like not charge for housing and have accessible everything. Mm-hmm. Like I traversed stairs, I know there's an elevator, but I traversed stairs to get to the gender neutral washroom, and that was just like a really interesting thought exercise just now.
Yeah,
it's perfectly fine if you don't want to bring the podcast in this direction, but you mentioned earlier on mental illness and the challenges that so I've been speaking to people in the past who were saying, okay, I'm struggling with depression, I'm struggling with anxiety, and I think I should bring that to the college. I should bring that to my church so they can understand better. Mm-hmm. And the first 90% of my brain is going, good idea. And there's 10% of the back which is thinking they will make all the right noises about supporting you and about embracing you and all that, but they will think differently about you. And I think that's a difference which our society is really struggling with right now. Mm-hmm. That we're making all the, again, like in so many other cases, we're making all the right noises, and yet in reality we have a template, we have a cookie cutter model, and we really struggle to embrace difference in this area. Is that something you've experienced?
Yeah, I think. In my previous career, was a really good example of that, where, people were willing to give me a bit of latitude because I was very obviously struggling with a number of things. Like, I'm quite time blind. I have no idea how long we have been sitting here. Mm. And so that manifests in when I'm not taking the bus, I am almost unable to show up to things on time. It's been a little bit better this semester. But yeah, I even first term at AST, I would wander into a 9 o'clock class, 20 minutes late and very bleary-eyed. And it's all connected to a form of ADHD that wasn't on the books when I was growing up, as far as I know. And I absolutely did not fit the stereotype of hyperactive little boy in public school. I was like this very, very bookish kind of weird kid that had a lot of flights of fancy. Mm-hmm. And so, it wasn't caught for what it was, we think, until my 20s. And, struggles with it have been up, down, backwards, you name it. A couple weeks ago, I went on a different medication that I thought would clear up a lot of the issues that the first medication, or the medication I was already on, was causing. My brain seized up. Mm. And I was terrified. I emailed all of my professors and said, I cannot see myself handing anything in this week because what it is like to be me right now is like being wide awake at a stoplight while a train is crawling by at 2 miles an hour.
Wow.
And we've gotten that sorted out a bit, but there are side effects from medication number 3 that are getting sorted out. Now, the temptation has been, I should quit all these things and, just restore my brain to some semblance of balance. I've been unmedicated. This time last year, I was unmedicated for depression, and I was basically non-functional. Mm-hmm. And yet, I still fall through the cracks. There are days where I wake up, and it's like, nothing is getting done today. And there are evenings when I'm trying to prepare a meal, and my hands are shaking because I've just forgotten to eat for 6 hours.
Yeah.
And I don't want to appropriate the disability paradigm. I said that about the gender paradigm several years ago. But there has had to be a lot of discernment around, I have an illness, and I have a disability which stems from that illness. Mm-hmm. And it's an intermittent disability, and I can cover it up really well. Mm-hmm. But there are points during which the mask slips, and I need to be vulnerable enough and honest enough to have people be aware of that. Yeah. And I have to rely on people's clemency almost.
Yeah. Yeah, and also I think again a broadening of categories. If we take how we've progressed from, you think of Victorian society, and then you move that forward to the 1950s. Well, there's a very, very narrow band of the kinds of behaviour that's understood as acceptable, and hopefully that's broadening out. And hopefully in the 21st century, where I read a study recently which suggested that over 50% of females in college are on medication for depression and anxiety, and so that's not abnormal. That's what it is. That's what it is to be human. And so hopefully,
that's what it is to be human in today's world.
Yeah, yeah. But hopefully, or the band of behaviors and practices and habits which are considered functional is broadening, and it has to. I think it has to broaden for the church to be what it's called to be. The realpolitik of the church, the pragmatism. I think when we're thinking about that pragmatism, we in the church will shake our fist when Greta Thunberg goes before people and says we need to make these radical changes or we're all going to die, and they go, well, we've got to be practical, So and we go, we will do the same thing, when we're evaluating a candidate for ordination. Oftentimes those kind of shitty little pragmatic arguments will feature again, and so hopefully we're in a process or a period of broadening. Hopefully, I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if it's the experience people have, but it's something that I would be, if I was struggling with those things, I'd also be always angry. Because people talk a good game, but they really don't.
I wonder why I'm not more angry. And in a way, I sort of have spent time in queer communities and activist communities. I've kind of checked out of activism almost because so many of my activist friends seem to be fueled by anger or fueled by their trauma. Mm-hmm. And so I ran back into the arms of Mother Church because I wanted to know what it was like to advocate for change being fueled by love, which seems cheesy in a secular context. There's this interesting dichotomy or duality, or I think even mutual relationship between broadening the circle to include the knowledge that more people are struggling with more things than we realize. And sort of widening the lens, owning that, affirming that. And meanwhile, as Christians, I feel we ought to be railing against a society that forces us to live at such a breakneck pace that if I am to function, I have to be on a ton of medication. For the longest time, I was chasing this ideal of success, which was getting up in the morning, feeling well rested, being able to freelance and do my thing until from 9 until maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then go spend time with friends, and it would all fund a nice bachelor apartment. Mm-hmm. And I've realized that's incredibly unrealistic under the current mental health situation, but also current social circumstances. Like, what does a bachelor apartment cost? Too much. More than I'm prepared to pay, for sure. And so, as Christians, why are we not clamoring for, housing should be free. There should be wheelchair ramps everywhere. And, even the medication itself, I find, is a sort of spiritual bypassing, because it is easier to be medicated for something than to figure out whatever the underlying trauma is that's caused me to be exhausted and melancholy. Most of the time, because I know I wasn't always like that. Like, what happened? I want to root it out and interrogate it like Jesus in the desert,
So, from a disability lens, I think that it is, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I think also there are some depressions and some different ways of being that we actually say is illness, but may just be a different way of being, and so that has tension all the time. So is Down syndrome, is it a disease or a condition, or is it just this is a different way of being, right? Like this kind of thing. And I think that some things are illnesses, which, like you say, if we get to the root of the problem and we find out what it is that might be causing this, then, and it might be able to be something that is changed. So if you didn't need medication, if you didn't live at this pace of life, then that's a problem. Like those two things don't go together. But with disability, I find so many times we medicalize it and we make it into something that is just a difference. I know, I remember meeting an idol, Robert Munch, and we went to see him when you were really little, Julia, and he's bipolar. And if he medicates, he cannot write, is what he said in this talk. And so he doesn't medicate because that's what makes him who he is. And so for him, saying that bipolar was something that should be, that was an illness that had to be fixed, for him, it was just a different way of being. And I think that's where we're at in this world, is trying to figure out what is something that needs to be fixed. If somebody is blind, should the ultimate goal be to make them be able to see? Or if somebody cannot hear, is the ultimate goal to make them be able to hear? Or is the ultimate goal to make a world where some people hear and some people don't?
I love the idea of making a world where some people hear and some people don't.
Right?
I watched a whole YouTube video on kind of designing a new wing of a deaf university and actually imagining what deaf space looks like. And it looks like wider corridors so people can sign, and mirrors everywhere so people can see what's going on behind them and more fully interact with the world.
Right. And that's where we're at with our churches, I think.
Yeah.
And I think, too, with mental illness and with ministry, what does ministry look like? Because I also think not everybody should be a minister. I think that there are certain characteristics and certain kinds of personalities that are really good for being a pastoral minister. And then there are others that are not. And so, like, for example, Julia is an amazing lay leader in the church, but probably being a minister like me and going to school for as long as I did wouldn't hold a lot of interest for you, right? You're kind of done with school. Although you always like to learn, right?
Yeah, I get school like books. Like everybody gets to have different kind of work, but I get like math book, like English book or whatever.
Yeah,
things,
you did all that in
like,
school, right?
But nobody else had.
You had different ones than other people.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's good. That helped you to learn the way you needed to learn. So I think it's like blowing up the whole system is what we need to do and relook at it. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to that with two parallel experiences. I'm actually a lot more creative when I'm not being medicated for ADHD because I'm just like the tiniest bit more impulsive. and my brain thinks, oh, wouldn't it be a good idea to write a whole thesis on like sci-fi theology? And then I lose interest very quickly and my brain doesn't follow through on it, except if I induce a state of hyperfocus, and that is very, very fickle, and it usually leaves me absolutely drained at the end of it.
Right.
Which is something I have relied on to complete projects. For example, the sci-fi theology paper from last term. Thanks. But it's just like, it's incredibly unsustainable.
Right.
Not saying it is a disadvantage across the board. There are many ways in which the way my brain is wired can be advantageous. Also, medicalization is such a really, really fascinating topic because we're beginning to see a demedicalization of transness. Right. And I think a common mistake a lot of people make is to assume that transness is a purely medical phenomenon. That, it is defined by being in the wrong body, quote unquote, and is defined by a process of medical transition with a beginning, middle, and end. Like a friend of mine once asked me, "Oh, are you looking to transition?" And I told them point blank, that's a really, really funny question, because it is exactly the same as if you had asked me, "Are you saved?" First answer is, I don't know. Second answer is, nobody's business but mine and God's. Third answer is, I aspire toward a state of theosis, I guess. Or in a Lutheran sense, I am a sinner and a saint simultaneously, like kicking down the sinner-saint binary every nanosecond of my life. Where was I? Medicalization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and medicalization of transness is so dangerous because it ignores the idea that trans and non-binary people have actually existed for thousands of years. We just had different terminology for them, like eunuchs or the perpetual virgins of early Christianity, who kind of cast off their veils and decided they were going to be leaders. And, in that time, that was a very genderqueer thing. Mm-hmm. The side wound of Christ, which is conceptualized in medieval literature as the womb through which the kingdom of heaven is born. That's a genderqueer body right there.
Mm.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating conversation, and I think I think a couple of things in tension. On the one hand, my hunch is that the healthy person in a world of secular materialism, in capitalism, ought be depressed and ought suffer from depression. It's I think it's a sign of a lack of a healthy self to be functioning perfectly in it, because we will medicate using other things, and I think that the theological grammars around those kind of things, whether it's Augustine or hearken we rest when it rests in thee, speak to like the topic of what we now call mental illness in a very, very fruitful way. I also agree 100% with what Tamsin is saying about, that the church should be looking at ways of challenging the forcing of people to medicate if they're going to function in this preordained way that we as a society say one must function, and that this is a dangerous thing, and this is a site of a site for liberation. I also and this is the Thomist in me, is I'm also a teensy bit on the fence on the blindness issue. In that, for sure, if someone wants to remain visually impaired, fantastic. And yes, it is an arbitrary construct that we say that good vision looks like this. Yet at the same time, from the Thomistic perspective, I think it's also perfectly okay to say that in a corporeal world, bodies can have shortcomings vis-a-vis the ends that we would want for our bodies. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be okay for someone to seek treatment without being a a traitor to. I know you're not suggesting that, like that at all.
I think ableist language is going to be it's an up and coming conversation, and for a different podcast probably, and with different guests, because I think that it's really interesting. A lot of reading that I did for my grad project had to do with ableist language and how we perceive things, and I think that it would be a very different conversation if you had somebody in this chair who had really done a lot of like thinking about this and also experienced it themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
And that'd be a great one for the future.
I think so. I think so. Any final comments, thoughts, questions?
Oh, so many. But there's no time.
Well,
I guess to me, picking up on the medicalization thread, I think being able to read transness not as a source of distress, because it's pathologized as a source of distress,
right?
But to read it as a source of joy and affirmation and pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human, almost, in the sense that we have thought of it as.
Yeah, I wonder, I think we've touched in the first half of the podcast at length about what transness can do for the church and how the church needs trans voices to broaden our categories that are thinking about God. I also wonder if the theological lens is ultimately one that can benefit the trans community by virtue of offering an end or a telos which isn't determined by biology or any of these other things, that are sort of that ultimately the true human, the perfect human, Jesus Christ, is genderqueer, and that this is the goal that we're hopefully moving towards.
I think like a lot of trans people that have been traumatized by the church don't have any idea that theology exists. And if we could maybe lead with that theology, we'd have a lot less traumatized people wandering around. That's on my mind. I want to say almost every minute of every day, but it does occupy my thoughts. And I feel like I could wrap that up really well, but it's not coming to me right now. You said that at one point that queer theology is the good look of Christianity in some ways. And it's that for me, I've seen in trans communities in which I've moved in this sort of failure of hope. And I'm very, very wary of talking about that outside of the trans community because it will invite all kinds of very difficult things. Yeah. But, often I've yearned for my trans friends to have a spirituality like mine, which is a spirituality of healing and a spirituality of unbrokenness, or a spirituality of healing through brokenness. Because, I very firmly believe the first generation of the church, they were marginalized people. They were living under physical and political oppression. It had to be a healing religion. It had to be a trauma religion.
Yeah, recovering from extreme forms of torture probably probably requires it. Tamsin, Shannon, Julia, thank you so much. Thank you for listening and watching. Please do leave some comments. Maybe Julia, Shannon, and Tamsin will be kind enough to respond to questions that you might have. And please do share this. I've learned a huge amount from it, and so thank you very, very much. And if you have too, then share it with people who, like me, can benefit tremendously from hearing these perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thanks
guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.